Okay, determinism, freedom, and moral responsibility is section 1. The readings for the second class are pages 2 through 9. General introduction by Edwards and Pabst. Introduction. Determinism is the theory that everything in the universe is entirely governed by causal laws. It asserts that whatever happens at some specific moment is the outcome of something that happened at a previous moment, i.e., that the present is always determined by the past. It may be difficult or impossible to prove that this theory is true, but most people accept it, or something very close to it, in their daily activities. They do so whether they are dealing with inanimate objects or with living organisms, whether they are concerned with involuntary or voluntary human behavior. Let us suppose, for example, that a doctor, after carefully examining a patient, announces that unfortunately he cannot offer any assistance since the patient suffers from a mysterious ailment, one, in fact, which has no cause. The patient would, in these circumstances, undoubtedly be justified in angrily telling the doctor to keep his jokes for some academic discussion group and in turning to somebody else for help. If the doctor had merely said that he had never come across this kind of illness before and that he knew of no cure for it, or that the cause of it had not yet been discovered, he would not necessarily consider his statement absurd. On the contrary, we might even admire him for his candor. We are ready to admit that there are illnesses whose causes are unknown. We are not ready to admit that there are illnesses without causes. Let us take another illustration. In Melbourne, Australia, weather forecasts for a period of 24 hours are exceedingly reliable. That is to say, the predictions based on the available atmospheric data and the known meteorological laws are almost always correct. In New York City, on the other hand, the official forecasts for a period of 24 hours in advance are more often wrong than right. Suppose someone came along and said, "There's an easy explanation for the successes of the Australian and the lack of the successes of the New York weather forecasts. In Melbourne, the weather is caused. There, it is the outcome of preceding conditions. But in New York, more often than not, the weather has no cause. It is cut off from, it is disconnected with what happened before." We would assuredly question the sanity of this man. For we all believe that the failures of the New York meteorologists are to be explained quite differently. We all believe that the weather in New York is just as much the outcome of preceding conditions as the weather in Melbourne. The forecasts are less reliable because of the greater complexities of the factors which have to be taken into account and the greater difficulty of observing them, but certainly not because no causal factors exist. It is exactly the same with human behavior. We, all of us, believe, to use Mill's words, that, quote, Given the motives which are present to an individual's mind, and given likewise the character and disposition of the individual, the manner in which he will act might be unerringly inferred that if we knew the person thoroughly and knew all the inducements which are acting upon him, we could foretell his conduct with as much certainty as we can predict any physical event. No one who believed that he knew thoroughly the circumstances of any case and the characters of the different persons concerned would hesitate to foretell how all of them would act. Whatever degree of doubt he may in fact feel arises from the uncertainty whether he really knows the circumstances or the character of some one or other of the persons with the degree of accuracy required, but by no means from thinking that if he did know these things, there could be any uncertainty what the conduct would be. End quote of Mill. Or, to quote Kant, the actions of men are determined in conformity with the order of nature, by their empirical character and by the other causes which cooperate with that character. And if we could exhaustively investigate all the appearances of men's wills, there would not be found a single human action which we could not predict with certainty. We do indeed occasionally say about people that they did, or so, end quote from Kant. We do indeed occasionally say about people that they did or felt certain things without a cause. Example, he was in a dreadful mood after an argument with his wife and took out his anger on his secretary, insulting her quite without cause. Or, suddenly he went berserk without cause and in a frightful rampage shot his mother and all his 7 children. Or, he hates the Jews without cause. However, we do not really, in such situations, mean literally that the actions or feelings are uncaused. We mean rather that they lack adequate justification or that their cause is unknown to us. We do not mean, for instance, that the Jew baiter's feelings have no cause, but that they have no good ground. We do not mean that the sudden epileptic fury came from nowhere. We mean that we do not know what caused it, and perhaps also that on the basis of what we knew about the man's previous record, we could not have predicted the attack. We believe that human actions are caused regardless of whether they are in or out of character, regardless of whether a person surprises us or acts in accordance with our expectations. Perhaps the following example will help make this clear. A determinist once engaged in a public debate with an indeterminist, i.e., a person who rejects determinism. The debate took place in a college classroom. By the rules of the college, everybody had to be out of the building no later than 11 p.m. In the course of his talk, the determinist predicted that his opponent would not be in the room or in the building at 2 o'clock the following morning. The indeterminist defied this prediction. He stayed on, presumably spent a miserable night, had himself discovered in the morning by the cleaning woman, and made sure that he was reported to the dean in charge of such matters for breaking the rules of the college. His action, of course, falsified the determinist's prediction and greatly surprised all who had been present at the debate. Nevertheless, everyone who heard of the indeterminist's bizarre performance had no doubt that it was just as much due to a cause as any of his other less unusual actions. Moreover, if it had been known how eager he was to defy the prediction, the outcome could have been predicted. Or, what, for our purposes, amounts to the same thing, in retrospect, we can explain his extraordinary behavior in terms of preceding conditions, just as completely as the more customary conduct of other people, who, in similar circumstances, would prefer sleep to defiance. Although we thus accept determinism, at least in our practical activities, the vast majority of people in our culture also indulge in judgments of moral responsibility, and at first sight it seems that these could never be justified if determinism were true. For we hold people responsible only for those actions which they performed freely, in the sense that they could have done something other than what they did. But if determinism is true, then everything people do is completely caused, and given the causal antecedents in any particular case, nothing could happen except what does happen. It seems to follow that nobody can ever act differently from the way he acts, and hence that freedom must be an illusion and that human beings are never properly accountable for their conduct. Alternatively, if freedom is not an illusion, determinism must be false. The apparent conflict between determinism and freedom has also been formulated in the following way. Let us consider some example of a momentous choice in recent history. Example, Harry Truman's decision to drop the atomic bomb on Hiroshima. We would normally say that Harry Truman was a free agent in this matter, that there were several alternative courses open to him. Some people have praised him for what he did, while others have cursed him. But all of them, including Harry Truman himself, agree that he carries the responsibility for the decision. Now, if determinism is true, it has been argued, it would be absurd to hold Harry Truman responsible, since all he did was predetermined long before he was born. If determinism is true, then the whole future of the universe is in principle predictable. As the result of our imperfect knowledge of the existing conditions of any particular moment and our imperfect knowledge of causal connections, our predictive ability is in practice severely limited. This, however, does not affect the point at issue. Suppose there were a super scientist who knew absolutely everything happening in the universe at one particular moment, say 8 a.m. on January 1st, 1800. Suppose further that the super scientist knew absolutely every causal law. If determinism were true, he could predict the entire future of the universe, including Harry Truman's instructions to drop the atomic bomb. But in that case, Harry Truman's choice was a bogus affair. If the outcome was known, or rather knowable in advance, he cannot properly be said to have been choosing. And what is true of Harry Truman's decision applies equally to all apparent choices of all other human beings. They are merely apparent and not genuine, if determinism is true. When determinism is stated in this way, it appears as a paralyzing doctrine which implies that human efforts are quite pointless. As Eddington put it, what significance is there to my mental struggle tonight whether I shall or shall not give up smoking? If the laws which govern the matter of the physical universe already preordained for the morrow a configuration of matter consisting of pipe, tobacco, and smoke connected to my lips. Unquote. In the light of these and similar considerations, philosophers have asked themselves, which is true, determinism or freedom? Or can we perhaps believe in both and show that there is no conflict between them? There are three possible answers to these questions. And important writers can be quoted in support of all three. There are, to begin with, philosophers who accept determinism and reject freedom. They usually reason somewhat along the following lines. All the objective scientific evidence favors determinism. It is true that human beings have a feeling or an intuition of freedom. A rational person, however, must be guided by objective evidence and not by intuitions. In our book, this position is represented by Paul Rée. Among the great philosophers, Spinoza and Schopenhauer may be cited as supporters of this view of a view of this kind. And many celebrated thinkers outside of the fold of professional philosophers adopted it. Einstein held it, so did Freud. Many famous novelists and poets held it, including Melville, Mark Twain, Arthur Schnitzler, A.E. Housman, and Thomas Hardy. The greatest lawyer the United States ever produced, Clarence Darrow, made this view the basis of many of his successful court pleas, as well as of revolutionary suggestions concerning the treatment of criminals. In the famous plea, in which he tried to save the lives of the boy murderers Loeb and Leopold, Darrow returned to this theme again and again. We are all helpless. This is a quote. This weary old world goes on, begetting with birth and with living and with death. And all of it is blind from the beginning to the end. I do not know what it was that made these boys do this mad act, but I do know there is a reason for it. I know they did not beget themselves. I know that any one of an infinite number of causes reaching back to the beginning might be working out in these boys' minds, whom you are asked to hang in malice and in hatred and injustice. Nature is strong and she is pitiless. She works in her own mysterious way, and we are her victims. We have not much to do with it ourselves. Nature takes this job in hand, and we play our parts. In the words of old Omar Khayyam, we are, quote, so a quote within a quote, we are, quote, but helpless pieces in the game he plays upon this checkerboard of nights and days, hither and thither moves and checks and slays, and one by one back in the closet lays. What had this boy to do with it? He was not his own father. He was not his own mother. He was not his own grandparents. All of this was handed to him. He did not surround himself with governesses and wealth. He did not make himself. And yet, he is to be compelled to pay. End quote. Similar sentiments are expressed by Mark Twain in his highly unorthodox Reflections on Religion, written in 1906, but not published until 1963. Man is not to blame for what he is, he says. He didn't make himself. He has no control over himself. All the control is vested in his temperament, which he did not create, and in the circumstances which hedge him round from the cradle to the grave, and which he did not devise. He is as purely a piece of automatic mechanism as is a watch, and can no more dictate or influence his actions than can the watch. He is a subject for pity, not blame, and not contempt. He is flung head over heels into this world without ever a chance to decline. Secondly, there are philosophers who, agreeing that determinism is not compatible with freedom and moral responsibility, accept freedom and reject determinism. This position has been justified in many different ways, but perhaps the most common defense proceeds along these lines. Nothing can be more certain than what is given in immediate experience. For if, for instance, I see a white patch or feel pleasure, this is more certain than any complicated theory, no matter how eminent the supporters of that theory may be. Now, our experience of freedom is a datum of immediate experience, while determinism is at best a complicated theory. If the two conflict, this indicates that there must be something wrong with determinism. It is true that sometimes we make erroneous judgments of perception. For instance, we might, looking at an object from a distance, judge it to be black, although on closer examination it turns out to be red. But the case of freedom is different. Here, further experience only serves to confirm our conviction. On every new occasion, when I am confronted with several alternatives, I once again experience my freedom. In the words of Henry Sidgwick, quote, It is impossible for me to think at such a moment that my volition is completely determined by my former character and the motives acting upon it. The opposite conviction is so strong as to be absolutely unshaken by the evidence brought against it. I cannot believe it to be illusory. So far, it is unlike the erroneous intuitions that occur in the experience of the senses, as example, the imperfections of sight and hearing. For experience soon teaches me to regard these as appearances whose suggestions are misleading, but no amount of experience of the sway of motives even tends to make me distrust my intuitive consciousness, that in resolving after deliberation I exercise free choice as to which of the motives acting on me shall prevail. Unquote. Moreover, our moral consciousness must not be denied a hearing, and an adequate philosophy ought to do justice to it. If a scientific theory conflicts with the revelations of our moral consciousness, this, in the last analysis, may be so much the worse for the scientific theory. Among the philosophers represented in this present book, William James, H.D. Lewis, and C.A. Campbell take a view of this kind. It also found in many religious philosophers, such as those, especially those with a Catholic background. The same conclusion, though partly for different reasons, was defended by the English physicist Sir Arthur Eddington, who believed that recent discoveries in quantum physics had important bearings on the problem of freedom and determinism. It should be added that while James and Eddington unhesitatingly identify freedom with chance, Campbell and his 18th century predecessor Thomas Reid refuses to do so. Campbell speaks in this connection of contra-causal freedom, and he insists that a contra-causally free act is to be carefully distinguished both from actions which are in principle predictable and from chance actions, if such ever occur. There are, finally, philosophers who maintain that both determinism and our belief in freedom are true, both, and that any appearance of conflict is deceptive. A reconciling position of this kind was advocated by Kant, in whose work, however, it depends on a highly speculative bifurcation of the universe into the world of noumena and the world of phenomena, which is accepted by very few contemporaries. Hegel and his disciples, notably the British philosophers Green and Bradley, also put forward a theory which attempted to reconcile determinism and freedom. The same theory, incidentally, is found in Engels and other Marxist writers who followed Hegel completely on this subject. But this attempt at reconciliation, like Kant's, has few adherents today, at least in the English-speaking world. There is, however, a third variety of this general position, which is very widely held. This view goes back at least as far as Hobbes and was given its classic treatment by Hume and Mill. It is therefore sometimes called the Hume-Mill theory. In our book, it is represented by the extracts from Mill and Schlick. The main idea behind this theory is very simple. If by free we meant uncaused, then of course determinism would imply that nobody is ever a free agent. But when we call an action free in ordinary life, we never mean uncaused. And this most emphatically includes the kind of conduct about which we pass moral judgments. By calling an action free, we mean that the agent was not coerced, that he was acting from or in accordance with his own unimpeded desire. Thus, if I take a ride in a car because I have been kidnapped, what I do is not free since I act under a threat. Again, if I hand over money to somebody as the result of a post-hypnotic suggestion, something I would not have done but for the hypnotic influence, I am not free since my action springs from somebody else's desire and not my own. But if I take a car ride or give money to a beggar, not because I'm threatened or because I am under hypnotic suggestion, but because I like to do these things and decided to do them, then my actions are free. My actions are free, although they are just as much caused as any unfree action. They are free, although anybody knowing my general disposition and the state of my body and mind at the preceding moments could have predicted them without difficulty. Contemporary defenders of this view, who are familiar with the facts concerning compulsion neurosis, would be inclined to qualify the definition of free mentioned in the last paragraph. An action is free, they would say, if it comes from an unimpeded, rational desire on the part of the agent. Well, it may not be easy to give a general definition of rational desire in this context. There would be, up to a point, very general agreement as to which desires are rational and which are not. For example, if a rich kleptomaniac steals an article he does not need, he is not a free agent because the desire from which he is acting is not rational. But if I go into a restaurant and order a steak, not because I suffer from a compulsion neurosis, at least not concerning steaks, but simply because I desire to eat a juicy, tender, and nourishing steak, my action is free. I am acting in accordance with an unimpeded, rational desire. Philosophers who adopt this position emphatically deny that they are fatalists and that determinism, as they understand it, is a paralyzing doctrine. There is a famous dilemma which may help to illustrate the difference. According to this dilemma, if a person falls off a ship into the sea, it is senseless for him to make an attempt to be saved, for he is either fated to drown or else fated to be saved. In the former case, efforts are of no avail, and in the latter, they are unnecessary. This is the position of fatalism. An advocate of the Hume-Mill theory, on the other hand, would maintain that there is a third alternative which has been omitted. The man who fell into the sea may be saved because of his efforts. Because, for instance, others may hear his cries. The fact that his efforts are themselves caused in no way cancels out the fact that the efforts were, in the case imagined, the cause of his rescue. Determinism on the Hume-Mill theory does indeed claim that all human actions are in principle predictable. It does not claim that all actions are predetermined. If this means that what human beings do is always independent of their desires, choices, deliberations, and other psychological states and aspirations, the super scientist on this view could have predicted Harry Truman's order to drop the atomic bomb on Hiroshima, but he could have made the prediction only by taking into account Harry Truman's desires and interests and hopes and fears and reflections on the consequences of alternative courses of action. The super scientist, in this picturesque formulation of determinism, is not, it should be noted, a super blackmailer or a super hypnotist. He is not influencing or constraining Harry Truman. He is only predicting what will be done. Most defenders of the Hume-Mill theory trace back the belief that determinism and free will are incompatible to two factors. So they trace back that belief, the one they deny, to two factors: to certain confused anthropomorphic notions about causation, and also to certain unrecognized ambiguities in ordinary speech. The latter would be said to occur particularly in connection with expressions like "nothing could have happened except what actually happened," or "this event had to happen." These expressions are commonly used in two very different senses. In one sense, which may be called the regularity sense, they merely designate certain invariable sequences. Thus, if one billiard ball strikes another with a certain force and the second ball moves, it might easily be said that given the impact of the first ball upon the second, given the application of an unbalanced force, the second ball had to move. It could have done nothing else. But this means no more than that there is an invariable sequence between the application of net forces and the motion, or strictly the acceleration of the bodies to which the forces are applied. It means that if we know the magnitude and direction of the unbalanced force, it is possible to predict that the ball will move in a certain way and not stay at rest or move in any other way. When we say the second ball had to move, we do not mean the presence of a constraining or compelling influence, such as may occur in a situation involving human beings. We do not mean that the first billiard ball said to the second, "Listen here, you scoundrel, move or I'll knock your brains out." Nor do we mean that the second ball suffered from a compulsive urge of the kind that makes us say, in the case of the kleptomaniac, that he had to act the way he did. However, when we when we say about a human being that he had to act the way he did, or that he could have done nothing else, we do, as a rule, mean to assert the presence of a constraining influence like a threat or a compulsive urge. This may be called a constraint, such a constraint. Sense of the ambiguous expressions we are discussing. This may be called the constraint sense of the ambiguous expressions we are discussing. Now, a defender of the Hume-Mill theory would argue that determinism, properly understood, does indeed entail that nothing in the universe, including all human actions, could have been different from what it is. But determinism applies this only in the regularity sense, which does not at all exclude freedom. Determinism is taken to negate freedom when it is tacitly misunderstood to claim that no human action could ever have been different in the constraint sense. According to these writers, the regularity sense of nothing else could have happened, or this had to happen, or it was necessarily so, and similar expressions must also be carefully distinguished from the sense in which they designate logical necessity, as when they say, for example, that 2 + 2 has to equal 4, and that the sum of the interior angles of a Euclidean triangle must necessarily equal 180 degrees. When a defender of the Hume-Mill theory asserts that no event in the universe could have failed to occur, he implies, given the total set of preceding events. If C is the total set of relevant conditions preceding event E, the occurrence of E was necessary in the sense, and only in the sense, that whenever and wherever conditions like C obtain, an event like E follows. The law connecting C and E is not logically necessary in the sense that it would be self-contradictory to suppose exceptions to it, nor is the occurrence of any particular event asserted to be logically necessary. There's something very attractive about all reconciling theories, since they allow us to go on believing both in freedom and in determinism. The Hume-Mill theory, in particular, as already noted, has many adherents among contemporary philosophers. It is, however, far from universally accepted, and especially during the last 2 decades, several philosophers have had second thoughts about it. There are, to begin with, those who simply do not regard determinism as tenable. Some philosophers have recently argued that the very nature of an action implies that it cannot be caused in the familiar sense in which the motion of a billiard ball or a reflex is unquestionably caused, and in which determinists regard all actions as caused. Writers in the Hume-Mill tradition are frequently criticized in this connection on the ground that they did not adequately distinguish between reasons and causes. This general line of attack is represented in our book by Ben and Peters in section 9. It has also been argued that the account offered by the reconcilers of what we mean when we call an action free is seriously defective. This line of attack is represented by C.A. Campbell in section 7. All these critics are opposed to determinism, but the position of the reconcilers has also been attacked by determinists as being, in certain important respects, evasive and superficial. It has been argued, for example, see Hosper's Free Will and Psychoanalysis, section 8, that the reconcilers have a very inadequate conception of the springs of human conduct. They are taking account, for the most part, of conscious motives only, leaving out of account the deeper unconscious influences. Rephrasing a famous saying of Spinoza's, such a critic might say that the followers of Hume and Mill believe themselves free because they are ignorant of the true causes of their actions. The charge that the Hume-Mill theory constitutes an evasion need not, however, rest on an appeal to the role of unconscious motivation. It can and has been advanced by writers who did not question that the real causes of an action are disclosed in introspection. The reconcilers, it has been said, do not pursue the subject far enough. They stop arbitrarily at the desires or volitions which are the cause of some of our actions. We must not stop there. We must go on to ask where our desires come from. If determinism is true, there can be no doubt about the answer to this question. Ultimately, our desires and our whole character are derived from our inherent equipment and from the environmental influences to which we are subjected at the beginning of our lives. It is clear that we had no hand in shaping either of these, and we cannot rationally be held responsible for them. Hence, if determinism is true, we are ultimately not really free, at least not in the sense required for moral responsibility. Schopenhauer expressed this thought in a telling epigram. A man can surely do what he wills to do, but he cannot determine what he wills. Thus ends the reading for our next section, the introduction to the topic of determinism, free will, and moral responsibility. I will see you next time where we'll discuss all these things, and that will be fun.